3 days after her mother's funeral, Zaria Monroe's husband smiled at the breakfast table and told her they had finally taken care of a piece of dead weight. She set down her coffee cup and asked him what he meant. He said the house was gone, sold, handled, and that she should feel relieved rather than sad. For a long moment, Zaria simply stared at him, certain she had misheard, because the house he was talking about was the house where her mother had lived for 4 decades, the house where 3 generations of women in her family had learned to cook, to grieve, to forgive, and to keep secrets. What Ethan Holloway did not know was that years earlier, her mother had made her sign a strange set of legal papers that nobody in the family ever mentioned again. And what he was about to learn, slowly and then all at once, was that some inheritances cannot be undone by a signature on a sale agreement. Zaria had grown up in that house on Larkspur Street, a modest brick colonial with a wraparound porch and a magnolia tree that dropped white petals across the front walk every spring. Her mother, Eleanor Monroe, had bought it as a young widow, raised 2 daughters inside its walls, and filled every room with the quiet evidence of a life carefully assembled. There were shelves of hand-bound journals, a cabinet of pocket watches that had belonged to Eleanor's father and grandfather, oil paintings collected over the decades from local artists whose names would later matter more than anyone expected, and a cedar chest of letters tied with ribbon that Eleanor never let anyone read while she was alive. Zaria was now 42 years old, an archivist by profession, the kind of woman who spent her working life at a university, preserving old documents so that history would not simply evaporate. She understood better than almost anyone that the objects people leave behind carry weight far beyond their price tags. Ethan was different. He was 45, a real estate investment broker with a talent for closing deals and an unshakable confidence that had carried him from a modest upbringing into a life of tailored suits and quarterly bonuses. He was charming at dinner parties and relentless in negotiations, and for most of their 12 years of marriage, Zaria had found those qualities admirable rather than alarming. He had a way of walking into a room and immediately understanding who held influence and who did not, a skill that had made him remarkably successful in his career and, for a long time, an exciting partner to build a life alongside. In their early years together, Zaria had often teased him about seeing everything through the lens of value, joking that he probably calculated the resale worth of restaurants before deciding where to eat. She had never imagined that instinct would one day turn toward her own mother's home. Eleanor had liked Ethan well enough, though she had never fully warmed to him the way she warmed to Zaria's sister's husband, a quiet school teacher who spent hours listening to Eleanor's stories about her own mother and grandmother without ever checking his watch. Eleanor was polite to Ethan at family dinners, asked about his work, complimented his success, but Zaria sometimes noticed her mother's eyes lingering on him a beat too long when he spoke about property values or market trends at the table, as though she were quietly filing something away for later. At the time, Zaria had dismissed it as her mother simply being cautious with a son-in-law who came from a different world than the one Eleanor had built with her own 2 hands. She never once suspected that her mother's quiet observation would one day become the very thing that saved her. But grief has a way of exposing what comfort had hidden, and in the weeks after Eleanor's death, something in Ethan's tone had begun to shift. He spoke of the house not as a place full of memory, but as an asset, a line item, a piece of dead capital sitting in a neighborhood whose property values were rising. At the funeral, he had held Zaria's hand and whispered that he was there for her, that she did not need to worry about anything, that he would take care of everything. She had believed him because that was what husbands were supposed to do, and because in 12 years of marriage he had rarely given her a reason to doubt his intentions, only his priorities. Only days later, while the flowers on Eleanor's grave were still fresh, Ethan began suggesting that the house needed to be dealt with quickly. He said the upkeep alone would drain them, that an empty house depreciated faster than people realized, that grief was easier to move through when there was nothing left tying them to the past. Zaria told him she was not ready. She told him she needed time before deciding what to do with her mother's home, let alone the contents inside it. He nodded, said he understood, and told her to take all the time she needed. 2 days later, When a work conference pulled her out of town, Ethan quietly began making calls of his own, and by the time Zaria's plane landed back home, the wheels of a transaction were already turning behind her back. She did not learn any of this until she drove straight from the airport to Larkspur Street, wanting simply to sit on her mother's porch and breathe for a while before facing her empty apartment. The conference had been long and exhausting. 3 days of panels and archival workshops in a city she barely remembered afterward, and the only thing that had kept her going through the final afternoon was the thought of sitting on the porch swing where she and her mother used to shell peas together every summer. She had even bought a small bag of peppermint candies at the airport, the same kind Eleanor used to keep in a dish by the front door, planning to leave them there as a small private ritual of her own. What she found instead was a locksmith's van, parked in the driveway, and a stranger crouched at the front door, replacing the old brass lock with a shining new one. Zaria stood frozen on the sidewalk, her suitcase still in her hand, watching a man she had never met work on the door of the house where she had learned to walk, where she had brought home her college diploma to show her mother, where she had once slept curled beside Eleanor's hospital bed during the final weeks of her illness, rather than leave her alone at night. For a moment she thought she had the wrong address, though she had known this street her entire life, though she could have walked it blindfolded and still found her way to the third step that always creaked. Then the man glanced up, offered her a polite nod, and asked if she was there about the closing paperwork, as though her entire world had not just tilted sideways on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She did not answer him right away. She stood on the sidewalk with her suitcase handle biting into her palm, watching the old brass lock, worn smooth by decades of her mother's hand, come loose and drop into a small plastic bag the locksmith had ready for it, as though it were nothing more than scrap metal to be discarded. Ethan arrived less than an hour later, summoned by a call from the locksmith confirming the job had gone smoothly, and his calm expression told her everything before he said a single word. He walked toward her with the easy stride of a man returning home from an ordinary errand, and when he reached her he even smiled, as though he expected her to share in some small private triumph. He explained, as though describing something perfectly reasonable, that he had sold the house. He said it plainly, the way he might announce he had picked up dry cleaning, and for a heartbeat, Zaria genuinely believed he was joking, waiting for the punchline that never came. When she asked him to repeat himself, her voice thin and unfamiliar even to her own ears, he simply nodded and told her again, more slowly this time, as though she were the one struggling to understand something simple. He told her the process had been remarkably efficient, that he had found a serious buyer within days, that the paperwork had moved through title and escrow faster than he expected, given how much he had streamlined things by handling her signature himself. He said this last part almost proudly, as though efficiency alone could excuse what he had done, as though speed were a virtue, capable of erasing the fact that none of it had ever been his decision to make. Zaria felt the sidewalk tilt slightly beneath her feet, and she reached out to steady herself against the porch railing, the same railing her mother used to grip during her final months, when her legs grew too weak to trust on their own. Before she could find the words to respond, a black sedan pulled up along the curb, gleaming and out of place against the modest houses lining the street. A well-dressed man in his late 50s stepped out carrying a leather folder, his gray suit immaculate, his manner unhurried in the way of someone accustomed to being the most composed person in any room. He introduced himself as Victor Langford, a businessman who bought and restored historic properties throughout the region, explaining with genuine warmth that he had fallen in love with the architecture of the house the moment his realtor sent him the listing photographs. He said he was very pleased that everything had gone through so smoothly, extending a hand toward Zaria, as though this were simply the happy conclusion of a routine transaction, rather than the unraveling of everything she had left. Zaria's hands went cold as Victor opened the folder and showed her the signed documents, all of them bearing Ethan's signature and, disturbingly, a notarized statement asserting spousal authority over the property. Ethan had used his position as her husband to claim the right to act on her behalf, insisting to the title company and the notary that Zaria fully supported the sale and simply could not be present due to travel. When she confronted him, her voice shaking with disbelief, rather than volume, he did not flinch. He told her he was her husband, that he had every right to make decisions that protected their financial future, and that she would thank him once the grief faded and she understood how much sense this made. He said the house had become a burden neither of them needed to carry, and that he had simply done what any responsible partner would do. Victor, sensing the tension but eager to move forward with his renovation plans, informed them both that his crew would begin clearing the interior within 48 hours. He explained, not unkindly, that his intention was to gut the property down to its original bones and restore it as a period showcase, which meant that everything currently inside, the furniture, the paintings, the boxes in the attic, all of it would need to be removed and discarded to make room for his vision. Zarya felt something harden inside her chest as she watched him speak so casually about erasing her mother's entire life in less than 2 days. She said nothing more to Ethan. She simply turned, walked back to her car, and sat behind the wheel for a long time before she remembered something her mother had told her years earlier. A conversation she had buried so deep in memory that it took the shock of the moment to bring it back to the surface. It had happened nearly a decade before, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, when Eleanor had asked Zarya to sit with her at the kitchen table instead of the living room, which even then had struck Zarya as unusually formal. The kitchen table was where Eleanor conducted business, where she had once sat with an accountant to sort out taxes after Zarya's father passed, and where she had once negotiated, calmly and firmly, with a contractor who tried to overcharge her for a roof repair. Sitting Zarya down there rather than on the living room sofa had been, in hindsight, its own kind of signal, though at the time Zarya had simply assumed her mother wanted better lighting to read the fine print. Eleanor had set out a folder of documents, thick and official-looking, bound with a rubber band that had clearly been wrapped and unwrapped several times already, and told her daughter that she needed her to sign them without asking too many questions that day. Zarya remembered laughing a little, asking if her mother was joining some kind of secret club, and Eleanor had not laughed back. She had simply slid the folder closer, tapped the top page twice with one finger, and waited. Zarya remembered flipping through pages dense with legal language she only half understood at the time, seeing words like inventory and trust and personal property schedule, and asking her mother, half joking, whether she was planning on dying anytime soon. Eleanor had given her a long, steady look before answering that everyone eventually did, and that the people who prepared for it with clear eyes were the ones who left the least mess behind for the people they loved. Instead of explaining further, Eleanor had looked at her daughter with an expression Zarya had rarely seen, somewhere between tenderness and warning, and said that the house itself did not matter nearly as much as what lived inside it. She said a house could be bought, sold, rebuilt, or torn down by anyone with enough money and the right paperwork. But the things a family collected over generations, the letters, the photographs, the objects touched by hands long gone, those could not simply belong to whoever happened to hold the deed. She told Zarya that she did not need to keep the house forever, but she must never allow anyone to take what was inside without a fight. She had said one more thing that day, quietly, almost as an afterthought, that Zarya had not understood until years later, standing on the sidewalk outside a house with a new lock on the door. She said that some people love a house, and some people only love what a house is worth, and that a smart woman learns the difference long before it costs her everything. At the time, Zarya had signed the papers mostly out of trust, assuming her mother was simply being careful the way older women sometimes were about legal matters. She remembered an inventory ownership agreement, a personal property schedule listing dozens of specific items, and something called a trust attachment that Eleanor had explained only briefly before sliding the folder into a small, fireproof safe bolted inside the closet of the guest bedroom. Zarya had not thought about that day in years, but now, sitting in her car outside the house she had just watched become a stranger's property, the memory returned with startling clarity. She drove straight to her mother's house, ignored Ethan entirely as she brushed past him in the hallway, and went directly to the guest bedroom closet, where the small gray safe still sat exactly where it had always been. Her hands trembled as she entered the combination, A string of numbers spelled out in her memory as her mother's birth year and wedding anniversary, written together the way Eleanor always did for anything important. The lock clicked open, and inside she found the folder, just as she remembered it, slightly yellowed with age, but intact, filled with pages of dense legal language she had signed without fully understanding a decade earlier. The ink of her own signature faded, but still, unmistakably hers on every page. She called her attorney that same evening, a sharp and unflinching woman named Naomi Pierce, who had handled Zaria's professional contracts for years and had a reputation for reading fine print the way other people read headlines, catching clauses buried on page after page that other attorneys skimmed past without a second glance. Naomi had represented the university's archival department in several licensing disputes and had once helped Zaria negotiate a publishing agreement so airtight that a colleague still referenced it as a model years later. Naomi told her to bring everything over immediately, her voice sharpening the moment Zaria described what had happened, and within an hour, Zaria was sitting across from her in a cramped downtown office-lined floor to ceiling with case files. Watching Naomi's expression shift from curiosity to quiet astonishment as she moved through page after page. Naomi read slowly at first, then faster, occasionally circling a phrase or flipping back several pages to cross-reference a clause against something she had read earlier, murmuring to herself, in the particular way lawyers do when they sense they are looking at something unusually well constructed. She asked Zaria several pointed questions about the circumstances of the original signing, whether an attorney had been present, whether the documents had been properly notarized and recorded, and grew visibly more impressed with each answer that confirmed Eleanor had done everything correctly, leaving no gap through which a challenge might slip. When Naomi finally looked up, there was something close to admiration in her eyes. She told Zaria that her mother had done something remarkably clever, structuring the inventory ownership agreement so that every meaningful object inside the house, from the furniture to the artwork to the family documents, had been formally transferred into a separate personal trust years before her death, entirely apart from the real estate itself. In plain terms, Eleanor had split the house from its contents long before anyone thought to question it, ensuring that whoever eventually owned the physical structure would have no legal claim whatsoever to what filled its rooms. Naomi told Zaria plainly that the house could indeed be sold, and clearly already had been, but everything inside it remained hers and hers alone, protected by a trust that had nothing to do with marriage, real estate contracts, or Ethan's signature. Zaria sat back in her chair, feeling something between grief and relief settle into her chest, and for the first time since watching that locksmith change the front door, she allowed herself a small, tight smile. When Zaria told Ethan what she had found, he laughed, a short, dismissive sound that made it clear he had not grasped the seriousness of what she was saying. He waved a hand and said the contents of the house were nothing more than old furniture and outdated photographs, boxes of clutter that Victor's crew would be hauling to a landfill within days, regardless of what some old paperwork claimed. He told her the whole idea sounded like something her mother had cooked up out of sentimentality, a symbolic gesture rather than anything with real teeth, and that she should not waste her energy fighting over what he called junk. He picked up one of the framed photographs from the mantel as he spoke, an old black-and-white portrait of Eleanor as a young woman, and set it back down with a careless thud that made Zaria flinch as though he had struck something living rather than glass and wood. He even told her, with the particular carelessness of a man who believed he had already won, that if she wanted to keep a few keepsakes, she was welcome to grab them before the dumpsters arrived, as though he were doing her a generous favor rather than describing the planned destruction of her entire family history. He suggested, not unkindly in his own mind, that she take a weekend to go through the boxes herself, pick out anything with sentimental value, and let the rest go the way everything eventually had to go. He told her that holding on to old things was no way to move forward, that grief needed room to breathe, and that he had only ever wanted to help her release something she was too close to see clearly. Zaria listened to the entire speech without interrupting, watching him with an expression he mistook for consideration, when in truth she was simply waiting for Naomi's paperwork to finish printing in her mind already 3 steps ahead of him in a conversation he did not yet know he had already lost. Naomi did not respond to Ethan directly. Instead, she filed a formal legal notice with the title company, Victor's attorney, and the county recorder's office, asserting Zaria's ownership of all personal property inside the residence under the terms of the existing trust. Victor's legal team, reviewing the sale documents more carefully in light of the notice, discovered something Ethan himself had apparently overlooked in his rush to close the deal, which was that the purchase agreement he had signed only transferred the real property and structure itself, with no language whatsoever, addressing the transfer of personal belongings inside. In his hurry to prove his competence and finalize the sale before Zaria returned from her trip, Ethan had never bothered to have the contract reviewed for exactly this kind of detail, assuming, as he assumed about most things, that his confidence alone would carry him through any complication. Victor, a careful and experienced businessman, despite his eagerness to acquire the historic property, grew visibly uneasy once his attorney explained the situation. He had purchased the house expecting a straightforward gut renovation, not a legal entanglement over inherited belongings, and he made it clear to Ethan that he had no intention of becoming the target of a lawsuit over items he never intended to keep in the first place. Still, believing the situation to be a minor formality, Victor proceeded with his original plan and sent his renovation crew to the property on the scheduled morning, assuming the matter would resolve itself once the movers hauled everything to a storage unit for later disposal. The moment the crew began carrying furniture out of the house, hauling the mahogany writing desk down the front steps, while a second worker wrapped the hallway paintings in moving blankets, Naomi arrived at the property herself, her car pulling up sharply behind the moving truck, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy carrying an official notice barring the removal of any items from the premises, pending resolution of the ownership dispute. The deputy's presence alone was enough to freeze the crew mid-motion, several of them lowering boxes back onto the porch without waiting to be told twice. Naomi explained calmly to Victor and his foreman that continuing to remove property covered under an active trust claim could expose them to civil liability, regardless of their intentions or their lack of knowledge about the underlying legal situation. And she handed Victor a copy of the notice, along with a brief summary of the trust document itself, watching his expression shift as he skimmed the language. Victor, furious but pragmatic, immediately ordered his crew to halt all work and set the desk back down exactly where it had been, then turned to Ethan with a look of barely restrained anger, demanding to know why he had not disclosed any of this before the sale went through, his voice low and clipped in the way of a man doing everything he could, not to shout in front of his own employees. Ethan, for the first time since the ordeal began, appeared genuinely rattled, his earlier confidence cracking as he realized the situation was no longer something he could simply talk his way out of. He stammered something about the paperwork being a formality, an old sentimental gesture from an elderly woman that surely could not hold up against a properly executed sale. But even as he spoke, he could hear how thin the argument sounded, against a sheriff's deputy standing on the porch with an official notice in hand. Victor did not bother responding. He simply turned his back on Ethan and began speaking quietly with his own attorney on the phone, leaving Ethan standing alone on the steps of a house he no longer had any real claim to influence. Over the following days, as the legal dispute unfolded, a court-appointed appraiser arrived at the house to formally catalog every item still inside, a process that quickly revealed just how much Ethan and Victor had underestimated what they were dealing with. The appraiser, a soft-spoken woman with decades of experience valuing estates for probate court, moved room by room with a clipboard and a small camera, occasionally pausing to examine a signature in the corner of a painting or the maker's mark stamped into the base of a clock. What everyone had assumed to be ordinary household clutter turned out to include an extraordinary collection of antique pocket watches passed down through 4 generations of Eleanor's family, several pieces bearing the marks of respected watchmakers, whose surviving pieces had grown increasingly rare and sought after among collectors. The furniture, too, revealed itself to be far more than tired hand-me-downs. Several pieces dated back to the 19th century, including a mahogany writing desk with hand-carved detailing that the appraiser identified immediately as the work of a regional craftsman whose surviving pieces now sat in museum collections. There were original oil paintings hanging in the hallway, that Zaria had walked past 1,000 times without a second thought, painted by local artists decades earlier whose work had quietly appreciated as their reputations grew after death, the way art so often does. In the attic, tucked beneath old quilts, the appraiser found a cedar chest containing handwritten family letters, spanning back to the early 1900s, correspondence between Eleanor's own grandmother and relatives who had lived through wars and migrations, alongside a series of personal journals that historians at Zaria's own university later expressed serious interest in acquiring for their archival and historical value. The appraiser's final valuation, once every item had been carefully assessed, documented, and cross-referenced against auction records and collector databases, came to a figure that dwarfed the price Ethan had accepted for the house itself, more than doubling it once the letters and journals were factored in for their historical significance, rather than mere material worth. Victor read the appraisal report in silence, his expression shifting from disbelief to something closer to quiet horror as he realized how close he had come to authorizing the destruction of a collection worth more than the property he had purchased to contain it. Ethan, standing beside him, said nothing at all, his face draining of color as the true scale of his mistake settled over him like a slow, cold weight. It was only then that Ethan's composure finally broke completely. He came to Zaria not with anger, but with something closer to desperation, suggesting that perhaps they could still find a way to split the value of what remained, framing it as only fair given that they were still married and everything, in his mind, still belonged to both of them equally. Zaria listened to him without interruption, her expression unreadable, and when he finished speaking, she simply nodded toward Naomi, who calmly laid out the relevant clause from the trust agreement, stating explicitly that all property covered under the document had been designated as Zaria's separate inherited estate, entirely excluded from any classification as shared marital property under state law. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood with total clarity that his confidence had run headlong into something he had no power to negotiate, charm, or maneuver his way around. He had no claim, no leverage, and no standing, and the realization seemed to hollow him out in front of her eyes. A mediation session was eventually arranged to resolve the matter without dragging the case through a lengthy court battle, bringing Zaria, Naomi, Ethan, his own attorney, and Victor together around a long conference table downtown, the kind of sterile room with recessed lighting and a pitcher of water nobody touched. Victor made it clear from the outset that he had no interest in prolonged litigation and simply wanted a clean resolution so he could proceed with his renovation plans without further complication, explaining that every week of delay cost him money in contractor fees and lost momentum on a project he had already begun promoting to potential tenants. His attorney, a younger man with a stack of neatly organized folders, kept the conversation moving briskly, clearly eager to resolve the matter before it escalated into something more expensive for his client. Zaria proposed a straightforward arrangement, requesting 10 full days to have everything of value removed from the property and placed into proper storage, after which Victor would be free to renovate the house however he wished, down to the studs if that was what he wanted. She spoke calmly throughout, her voice steady in a way that seemed to unsettle Ethan, more than any amount of shouting could have, as though her composure itself were evidence of how thoroughly she had already moved past needing his approval for anything. Victor agreed readily, visibly relieved to have the matter settled without further legal exposure, but he insisted, reasonably, that all costs associated with the delay, including additional labor, storage fees, and any penalties tied to his original renovation timeline, be covered entirely by Ethan, given that the entire complication had originated from his failure to disclose the trust arrangement before the sale. He explained plainly, looking directly at Ethan rather than at Naomi or Zaria, that he had purchased the house in good faith, relying on Ethan's representations that the sale was authorized and complete, and that he had no intention of absorbing financial losses caused by someone else's dishonesty. There was no anger in his voice, only the flat clarity of a businessman, stating terms he considered entirely fair, which somehow made the words land harder than if he had shouted them. Ethan objected immediately, arguing that the financial burden should be shared, But his own attorney, visibly uncomfortable, quietly advised him that fighting the request would only extend the dispute and increase his legal exposure. Naomi pointed out plainly, without raising her voice, that Ethan was the one who had orchestrated an unauthorized sale, misrepresented his authority to the notary, and failed to conduct even basic due diligence on what the contract actually covered. Nobody in the room, not Victor, not his attorney, not even Ethan's own counsel, offered him any real defense, and by the end of the session, he had agreed to the terms simply because there was no version of the negotiation left in which he still held any power. It was during the process of packing and cataloging her mother's belongings, in the quiet days that followed the mediation, that Zaria came across a letter tucked inside the lining of the cedar chest, sealed in an envelope with her name written in Eleanor's familiar looping handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed permission slips and birthday cards and, later, hospital consent forms. She sat on the floor of the emptying living room, surrounded by half-filled boxes and rolls of packing paper, and opened it slowly, her fingers careful with the aged seal, as though the paper itself might be as fragile as the woman who had written it. As she read, she finally understood the full weight of what her mother had done all those years ago. Eleanor wrote that she had never fully trusted Ethan, not because he was unkind, but because she had noticed, over years of quiet observation at family dinners and holiday gatherings, how often his questions about the house circled back to its value, its location, its potential for resale, rather than any genuine curiosity about the family history it held. She recalled, in the letter, a specific afternoon when Ethan had asked her, almost casually over coffee, what she thought the property might be worth if she ever decided to downsize. A question Eleanor said had settled into her chest like a small, cold stone that never quite melted away in the years that followed. She wrote that she had said nothing to Zaria at the time because she did not want to plant doubt about a marriage that seemed, from the outside, to bring her daughter happiness, and because she understood that suspicion, once spoken aloud, has a way of poisoning even relationships built on solid ground. Instead, she had simply taken action in the way she knew best, quietly and legally, sitting through hours with an estate attorney to structure the trust exactly right, ensuring that no matter what happened to the house itself, the heart of the family could never be sold, discarded, or claimed by anyone who had not earned the right to it through love rather than marriage alone. She wrote that she hoped, sincerely, that Zaria would never need to open that folder, that she would live out her years, never once suspecting the precaution had been necessary. But she said she would rather her daughter never need the protection than need it and not have it. The letter closed with a single line that brought tears to Zaria's eyes as she read it alone in the empty room, her mother's voice rising off the page as clearly as if she were sitting beside her. If you are reading this letter, it means you kept your promise, and it means I was right to make sure you never had to lose everything at once. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of Ethan's decision unfolded fully, one after another, like dominoes that had been waiting patiently to fall. Victor completed his purchase of the now empty house, moving forward with his renovation as originally planned, and later sent Zaria a brief, courteous note thanking her for handling the situation with more grace than he believed he would have managed in her position. Zaria oversaw the careful transfer of her mother's belongings into a climate-controlled storage facility, working alongside a small team of archivists from her university who helped her properly catalog and preserve the collection, wrapping each painting in acid-free paper and logging every journal entry by date and author, with the same care she gave to any historical document that crossed her desk at work. Ethan, meanwhile, watched his reputation in professional circles begin to erode as word of the dispute spread quietly through the local real estate community, the way these things always did no matter how discreetly people believed they were being. Colleagues who once invited him to golf outings began finding polite excuses to decline his calls, and clients who had trusted him with significant transactions started asking pointed questions about due diligence procedures at his firm. Nobody said outright that he had tried to seize his dead mother-in-law's estate without authorization, but everyone in the industry seemed to know the shape of the story well enough to keep their distance. And in a business built entirely on trust and referrals, distance was its own kind of professional death sentence. He was made to cover not only the storage and delay costs from the mediation agreement, but also a portion of Zaria's legal fees, a financial blow that arrived alongside the much larger and more permanent loss of his marriage, as Zaria filed for divorce less than a month after the mediation concluded. She did not do it out of anger, though anger had certainly been present in those first difficult weeks. She did it because something fundamental had cracked open in her understanding of who he was, a realization that no apology or grand gesture could fully seal back shut. He had looked at the last physical thread, connecting her to her mother, and seen only a number, a transaction, a piece of dead weight to be cleared away for convenience. And once she understood that about him, she could not unknow it, no matter how many times he asked for another chance in the months that followed. Rather than dwelling in bitterness, Zaria chose instead to build something meaningful out of everything her mother had protected. She eventually sold a portion of the collection, primarily select pieces of furniture and a handful of paintings that held less personal significance, using the proceeds to establish a small historical preservation center named in her mother's honor. The Eleanor Monroe Center for Family Archives opened quietly the following spring, offering resources and guidance to other families, hoping to properly document and protect their own histories, a mission Zaria found she cared about more deeply than she had ever expected. She kept the most personal items for herself: the letters, the journals, the watches that had passed through 4 generations of hands, storing them not as monuments to loss, but as living proof that some things could never truly be sold. On a quiet afternoon nearly a year after that first terrible morning outside her mother's house, Zaria drove past the property on Larkspur Street and parked across the street for a while, watching the newly renovated exterior gleam under a fresh coat of paint, the magnolia tree still standing tall beside the porch, as though nothing at all had changed, even though everything had. Victor had kept the tree, she noticed, and the porch railing too, restored rather than replaced, and she found herself grateful for that small mercy, even though the house itself belonged to a stranger now. She sat in her car for a long while, engine off, watching the afternoon light move across the brick the way it always had at this hour, remembering summers on that porch, the creak of the 3rd step, the peppermint dish that had never made it back inside. She did not feel the ache she once expected to feel, standing there in front of a house that no longer belonged to her family in any legal sense. She understood now, in a way she had not fully grasped before, that the walls and the roof had never truly been the inheritance her mother left behind. The letters were safe in the archive center now, cataloged and climate-controlled, read by researchers who found in Eleanor's careful handwriting a portrait of an entire era. The watches sat in a locked case at the center's entrance, ticking quietly, kept running the way. Eleanor always insisted a watch should be, because a watch left still was a watch dying. The journals had found their way into a small permanent exhibit that Zaria walked past every week, still faintly astonished that her mother's private thoughts now educated strangers about a life fully and carefully lived. Ethan had believed he was selling off a piece of dead weight, an old house full of nothing but memories he considered replaceable, interchangeable, the kind of sentimental burden a smart man clears away to make room for something more efficient. What he never understood, and what Zaria now carried with quiet certainty as she finally started the car and pulled away from the curb, was that the most valuable thing inside those walls had never belonged to the house at all. It had belonged to the woman who filled it, and to the daughter who learned, just in time, exactly how far that woman had gone to make sure nothing could take it from her. Her mother had taught her, in the end, that memory could be protected by the law, that patience could outlast greed, and that a man's confidence, however polished, was never a substitute for a right he did not actually hold.